Welcome everyone to this second keynote in this year's Ljubljana conference with Dr. Pieta Savinotko, who is based in Finland. I'm Bianca Elzenbaumer, and I got the honor to chair this keynote, which is quite amazing because I think I'm very inspired by Pieta's work and have not yet heard her speaking about it. I've only read her work, so it's really a pleasure to be here. Today, Pieta will be sharing her PhD work, which was specifically looking at gardening, both in the home and in community gardens. She looked at mushroom picking, berry picking, and also at small-scale beekeeping. And she was very interested in looking at the multi-species connections within these kind of food production practices and within these food economies. And her keynote today is called Handmade Economies in Food Production and the Problem with the Plantationocentrism. And I agreed with Pieta that before she starts out sharing her PhD research, that I would situate her a little bit so that her work doesn't come out of a void, but we kind of can see how her life might have led her to choose exactly this topic. So Pieta grew up in rural Finland, and she moved to a town when she was a teenager. But actually, in Finland, the rural is never far away, even when you live in a town or in a city. And then she went on to study in Tampere University, where first she did a BA in environmental policy. And then she went on a kind of turn, probably one could say, doing an MA in gender studies, where in effect she worked as a research assistant. And there in the work she did come across kind of food production systems and was really getting interested in the theoretical perspective of multi-species relations involved in food production, while at the same time she was getting involved in urban gardening in Tampere. And this kind of connection led her on to do her PhD and to really take time to dig into what kind of relations are going on there in food production, what kind of economies are being created. And since she finished her PhD, she moved again out of the city. She is now living in a rural community, and she continues tending to a vegetable garden. In her research, she now works as a postdoc at the University of Eastern Finland, where she's looking at questions of post-ownership. So one could probably say she's moving into a slightly different field, but that's where she's situated at the moment. And I think now I would hand over to Pieta so that she takes us into the world of homemade food economies in Finland. Over to you, Pieta, with much pleasure.
Thank you, Bianca, for the introduction, and thank you also, Phil, for inviting me. I will now share my slides. Just in a minute. You can see them? Yes?
Yes, we can see them. It's all working.
Good. So, yes, indeed, thank you for inviting me. And it's an honor to present here at Ljubljana conference among you, the Community Economies Research Network, which I consider one of my academic homelands. So as Bianca told, the title of my lecture is Handmade Economies in Food Production and the Problem of Plantationocentrism. And indeed, it is mainly based on my PhD, which I defended a year ago here at the University of Tampere. In this lecture, I will first take a short look on the research which has been conducted in the network on the diverse and community economies of food. And then I will suggest a concept that may be useful in examining the economies of food production, that is plantationocentrism. I will proceed to explain how I have myself examined food production, focusing on its hands-on practices and modes. And as a more conceptual note, I will explain what I mean by keskinäinen toimeentulo and how it is related to community economies. But then, as a sort of an epilogue, I will return to plantationocentrism and approach it as an unsolvable trouble, guided by a specific mushroom and Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick. So let's begin with the diverse and community economies of food. Food is a prominent topic among diverse and community economies scholars and practitioners. If you look at the Handbook of Diverse Economies, food is mentioned almost 600 times, which is considerably more than, for example, matches on land or money. Food was even mentioned more frequently than the economic categories of property, transactions, enterprise, or finance. In the picture, you can see a road sign before a small farm, one of the places where I conducted my research. The sign says Talouskeskus, which literally stands for an economic center. And this is certainly how we in the Community Economies Network understand the significance of food and agriculture. Although the actual meaning of Talouskeskus here in the sign refers to the main buildings of a farm, so this is a deliberate misunderstanding. As a side note here, I will make some references to Finnish terms and concepts along the lecture, as I have mainly conducted my research in Finnish. And also because I find the Anglocentrism in diverse and community economies scholarship a bit troubling. You can find a chapter on this trouble in the handbook written by Tuomo Alhojärvi and myself, so I won't go deeper into that now. So I understand the prominence of food as a topic in diverse and community economies research as deriving from at least two directions. First, food is an extremely broad and diverse phenomenon in itself, and it is therefore connected to a multiplicity of different situated economic practices, agencies, and sites. You can put food into any of the economic categories used, for example, in the handbook, labor, transactions, enterprise, property, and finance, and find plenty of fruitful perspectives for research and action. Second reason why I think food is such an important topic in the Community Economies Network is that food is deeply a political issue. It's literally a vital topic. Food can be approached as a resource to be shared equitably, goods to be produced without exploitation, or a culture to be cherished in a sustainable way. For a diverse and community economies researcher or practitioner, food is full of significant and dynamic interdependencies worth to examine in detail. In the diverse and community economies research, food has been examined on one hand as the focal point for political action for different economic futures, like for example in the work of Jenny Cameron, Anne Hill, and Emma Sharp, just to mention a few. On the other hand, food is being approached as the everyday livelihood practices that attest the diversity of the lived economies of today, like in the work of Lucy Sovova, Oona Morrow, and Luke Drake. But in addition, food calls for incorporating multi-species perspectives to diverse economies, as it is obviously a more than human nature cultural issue. And this perspective has been present, for example, in the work of Elizabeth Barron, Gerda Royalwick, and myself. From the perspective of diverse and community economies, it's easy to see that food cannot and should not be understood solely as a capitalist economic, in capitalist economic terms, but rather that any capitalocentric view on food, its production, distribution, or consumption is severely limited. I have focused on food production in my research, looking at the ways in which food is being produced in different small-scale settings, in communities, in the cities, and in the forests. Based on my research, I suggest that capitalocentrism alone might not be enough to describe the forces and tendencies that undermine the diversity of food production practices, modes, sites, agencies, and knowledges. Food production, I state, is also affected by plantationocentrism, that is, the prioritization and privileging of plantation production. First, a few words about plantations. By a dictionary definition, a plantation is an artificially established forest, farm, or estate where crops are grown for sale. This can be elaborated in many ways. A historian, Sidney W. Mills, describes quite famously a plantation as the combination of a field and a factory. On plantations, the production is disciplined and precisely scheduled. Work is organized in interchangeable units. Production and consumption are separated, and the worker is alienated from the product as well as from the means of production. Furthermore, in his review article, Frederick L. Pryor sees plantation economies as characterized by the hierarchical organization and collectivity of labor, profit-making, and capital intensivity. According to these accounts, plantation production clearly resembles capitalist production, but it can also be seen as a prerequisite or a foundation for capitalist production, as an efficient way to provide an endless flow of standardized raw materials. Also, the history of violence on plantations is parallel or even more horrific than that of capitalism. Plantations were a central colonial institution which enabled the exploitation of natural resources through the exploitation of slave labor. However, plantations are not only a historical phenomenon, but also a very contemporary one. The ending of historical slave trade didn't mean the end of plantations. The expansion of plantations and the more or less forced labor on them continue in many post-colonial settings. Plantations continue to inflict violent eradication of lives and livelihoods of people, but also of non-human others. And for example, Donna Haraway and Anna Tsing have approached plantations from a more than human perspective, focusing on the ways how both human and non-human lives are transformed into resources in plantation agriculture. In their definition of a plantation, they point out, I quote, radical simplification, substitution of peoples, crops, microbes, and life forms, multi-species forced labor, and crucially, the disordering of times of generation across species, including human beings, end of quote. So my own humble contribution to these discussions is that it's not only the plantations per se which are problematic in food production and for life on Earth in general, but the problem is also the hierarchical ordering of food production in a way that prioritizes plantations and subsequently marginalizes other ways of producing food. Plantationocentrism, like capitalocentrism, renders the broad diversity of food production practices, sites, knowledges, and agencies invisible or intelligible, or subordinates them as other to plantations. Paraphrasing the famous description of capitalocentrism by J.K. Gibson Graham, in plantationocentric material semiotic practices, other forms of food production are understood primarily with reference to plantations as being fundamentally the same as or modeled upon plantations, or as being deficient or substandard imitations, as being opposite to plantations, as being complement to plantations, as existing in the place or orbit of plantations. So plantationocentrism can be defined as a material semiotic performative process in which plantations and related practices, knowledges, and agencies are enacted as more essential, more determining, and ultimately more real than their others. This way, plantationocentrism depoliticizes food production and narrows down political imagination regarding its current and future manifestations. And therefore, still following in the footsteps of Gibson Graham, I have utilized the methodology of reading for difference in order to see past and beyond plantationocentrism to the diversity of food production. In my research, I have focused on the handmade modes and practices of food production that are by definition marginalized in plantation-centric discourses and materialities. I have studied 3 different forms of food production in Finland with ethnographic methods. And as a background context, I can tell that many hands-on practices of food production are perhaps surprisingly common here. Of the adult population in Finland, 29% reports cultivating edible plants, 46% picks berries, and 33% mushrooms. Also, 2/3 of Finnish honey is produced in small apiaries. So in my research, I have examined first the diverse work practices in community-based agriculture. Second, urban beekeeping as a precarious multi-species livelihood. And third, the networks of subsistence and well-being in mushroom and berry picking. Furthermore, I have contemplated on the meaning of small-scale food production in the context of a Nordic welfare state. These 4 articles examine the handmade economies of food production from different perspectives. I have aimed at carefully situating the analysis in particular ethnographic settings, and therefore I cannot claim to have any comprehensive overall picture of the handmade economies of food production, even in Finland. There are countless other forms, practices, sites, etc. of food production by one's own hands, which make up all their particular economies. And instead of going into detail of any of these particularities, I would like here to discuss the performativity of the formulation of handmade economies of food production. From a plantation-centric perspective, small-scale hands-on practices of food production are seen and treated as, for example, communal action, a free-time hobby, or domestic chores rather than serious forms of production. And as something else than production, they are also deprived of their economic qualities. Here you can see plantationocentrism working in hand with capitalocentrism. Therefore, I use the wording handmade economies of food production as a counter-hegemonic act against both plantationocentric and capitalocentric understandings of food production and the economy. With this formulation, I suggest that the hands-on practices and modes of food production are significant beyond their particularity. So I'm kind of harnessing the performative power of economy to present food production by one's own hands as relevant in terms of livelihoods, labor, transactions, property, and so on. But this hand-centered formulation can also have other formative effects in addition to that. In my research, I have used the trope of hands as a way to highlight the relationality of food production. Whereas, for example, the expression small-scale food production centralizes the scale of the activity with a comparison to larger scales. So with handmade economies of food production, I suggest that the hands can be understood as both a material and semiotic mediator of relations. Hands enable reaching towards others and otherness, as well as handling, grasping, and touching them. These acts are always reciprocal, as the one who touches is always also touched themselves. Through hands, we both are affecting the world and are being affected by it. When it comes to food, this relationality is not to be understood as a two-way road between two separate entities, because food can be seen as actually blurring the rigid subject-object divide that most of us have learned. One can ask that, are we producing food, or isn't food actually producing us? Or are we not making each other in an endless process of becoming, as suggested by, for example, many indigenous ontologies, and more recently also by some Western scholars of relationality? So as hands point towards the embodied reciprocal relations of food production, food itself can be understood as the material manifestation of the relationality of life. Food binds us as bodily creatures to other bodies, which we consume to become what we are, and which then become us, permeating our boundaries and questioning our separation from the world. Based on my research, I claim that the entanglement of material subsistence and multi-species relationality is particularly present in the hands-on practices of food production. And in my research, I have attempted to conceptualize this entanglement in a way that could facilitate approaching the ethical questions embedded in it. I draw on the familiar theorization of community economies, which I also understand concerning the intimate relationality of material subsistence and how to negotiate it. I also lean on the concept of ecological livelihood by Ethan Miller, which describes the complex networks of more than human habitats and their inhabitants. However, these concepts derive from the Anglophone context, and there is a high risk of being lost in translation when used in other languages and cultures. As my research is empirically based in Finland, I have also conducted the conceptual work in Finnish, which actually enables quite interesting iteration of the problematic of relational materialities of life. The concept I have proposed is keskinäinen toimeentulo, which cannot be translated in English in any straightforward way. The latter part, toimeentulo, is often translated in English as livelihood. And livelihood, as suggested by Gibson Graham and Miller, is an economic category without the historical baggage or disciplinary power of the economy, which makes it a very suitable starting point here. Livelihood, they say, is open to a diversity of activities, skills, knowledges, and relations that's unlike capitalocentric hegemonic, or I might add plantationocentric discourses. It cannot be captured by generality, but instead livelihoods are linked to particular contexts, stories, and strategies. But toimeentulo, as it happens, has a double meaning. It refers not only to material subsistence or its means, but also to the action of getting along with something. The double meaning is especially evident in the verb form tulla toimeen. One can tulla toimeen by salary, by social benefits, or by homegrown vegetables, and tulla toimeen with people, with other living beings, and even with condition-like entities such as the weather, illness, or inflation. In my work, I have elaborated the concept and underlined its double meaning by adding the adjective keskinäinen as an attribute to the noun. And keskinäinen can be translated as mutual or reciprocal in English, and also the prefix inter can be translated as keskinäinen, such as in the word interdependence, keskinäisriippuvuus. So keskinäinen toimeentulo aims at portraying the entanglement of material subsistence and multi-species relations in food production, or maybe potentially in any sphere of life. This entanglement has ethical implications. It reminds us that there is no way to step outside the relationality of being, as we are constituted by it in a very material sense. But however, given the diversity of possible livelihoods and relations that constitute them, it would make little sense to aim at any uniform or universal ways to encounter this inevitable relationality that life is. Therefore, I suggest that the ethics of keskinäinen toimeentulo is recognizing interdependencies and bearing the responsibility of the continuation or discontinuation of these relations in their particularity. And here I once more lean on the Finnish concept of toimeentulo. To tulla toimeen with someone or with something does not imply any specific types of relations, but instead it refers broadly to kind of mundane, often inevitable ways of coexistence, sharing of time and space with something or someone as an act that is conscious but not necessarily chosen or unproblematic. So, to sum up, I have worked in the field of food production with the conceptual and methodological tools provided by diverse and community economies research, and also developed some iterations of the tools myself. I have suggested plantationocentrism as an adjacent concept to capitalocentrism to describe the tendencies to centralize plantation production at the expense of other production practices. Furthermore, I have explored the handmade economies of food production, similarly as diverse economies can be approached, both as existing practices and livelihoods and as a performative way to enact different understanding of food production and the economy. Finally, I have suggested the concept of keskinäinen toimeentulo to understand and act on the ethical challenge of the relationality of material subsistence related to and inspired by community economies. So I could stop here. These 3 steps form a quite straightforward theme or framework which could be used and which I also have used to better understand and make understandable food production in its diversity, and also to carve out possibilities for transformation. But as we know, the world is everything but straightforward, and therefore any uncomplicated account of it should raise suspicion. And I'm sure there's many suspicious elements in what I have presented, and you can raise them in the discussion soon. But here I will highlight one of them by going back to the concept of plantationocentrism and approaching it as more troublesome than it first may seem. I'm quite guided to the trouble by these brainy figures. So Chiromitra esculenta, or false moral, or the so-called brain mushroom, is an ascomycete fungus which fruits in spring and early summer. It grows on sandy soil, particularly in former coniferous forest areas, where the ground has been disturbed by forest harvesters or other machinery. Poisonous if eaten raw, but delicious when properly processed, the mushroom engenders a peculiar phenomenon every spring. Instead of flourishing forests, mushroom pickers in Finland head towards timber clearings, with even the forest floor preferably harrowed or scalped down to soil. I conducted walking interviews on these forest ruins with false moral pickers in spring 2018 around Finland, tracing their livelihoods, practices, and networks. The other figure here might be more familiar to many of you. Eve Kosowski-Sedgwick is a feminist scholar, a queer theorist, and affect theorist. And in the community of diverse economies research, she's best known for the theorizing of 2 related thinking strategies called preparative and paranoid reading. To explain them shortly, a paranoid reading is essentially aligned at anticipating negative effects in order to prevent them from happening, whereas a reparative mode is invested in seeking pleasure where possible and remaining open for surprise. Paranoia for Sedgwick is linked with a strong theory, meaning a theory which is wide in reach and capable of knowing from afar, in advance, and on behalf of others. Reparative stance, in contrast, is characterized by a weak form of theory, which is, I quote, little better than description of the phenomena which it purports to explain, end of quote, by Sylvan Tompkins in Sedgwick's famous essay from 2003. I don't think you disagree if I say that in diverse and community economies research, it is the reparative strategy that is favored. Capitalocentrism is associated with paranoia and strong theory, the sort of knowing which only inflicts more capitalocentrism. And diverse economies are linked with reparative reading and weak form of theory, which can bring about positive change. It is therefore tempting to approach also plantationocentrism this way, to regard it as paranoid and therefore a problematic way of knowing, and then turn to reparative reading for difference to explore the possibilities of producing food beyond plantations and enacting keskinäinen toimeentulo in the process. However, it is tricky not to think about plantations as a central element in food production when the food production takes place in landscapes like this, or this, or this. These photos from my interviews depict typical areas where false moral is collected. Timber clearings where the trees have been cut 2 or 3 years ago. They are not hard to find. Nearly all forests in Finland are managed in order to maximize timber production with something called rotation forestry, which means repeated cycles of clear-cutting, reforestation with nursery-grown seedlings, and thinning out the excessive trees. This type of forestry turns forests into plantations. The area and the species are alienated as resources for profit-making. If you look at the picture, the tree stumps at the forefront attest the violence embedded in plantation production. And in the forest in the background, you can see an example of non-human forced labor in action. The trees are growing in a disciplined manner, in straight lines, all of them the same species and age, until they are cut at the young age of 60 or 80 years. This type of forestry is one of the main reasons for biodiversity loss in Finland. Monocultures and the acceleration of life cycles make tree plantations uninhabitable for many endangered species. Plantations were not only present in the interviews as a background scenery, but also in many ways they were entangled in the practices of food production. For the extensive picking of false morals, timber clearings are essential. False moral cannot be found in large amounts in other locations. But it was not only false morals, but also raspberries and, for example, fireweed that are picked on timber clearings, and many other berries and mushrooms in areas affected by timber production, like in thinned-out forest areas. Furthermore, the infrastructure for timber production, like the forest roads and tracks of forest machinery, are commonly used in order to access picking sites for mushrooms and berries, and also when going, for example, fishing or hunting. So what I'm saying here that plantations are not only smothering lives and livelihoods, but also enable some hands-on practices of food production. And therefore, plantations are not only part of capitalist production chains, as I capitalocentrically suggested at the beginning, but also sites for diverse handmade economies of food production to flourish. Of course, the plantation forestry is also a problem for mushroom and berry picking. Cutting the trees means losing the forest for a human life. What is notable, however, is the ability of these types of gathering economies to adapt and to survive within the plantation-centric hegemony, as exemplified by the false moral itself in almost a banal way. So in a clearing site with false moral pickers, it is difficult to formulate a lean narrative from the critique of plantation-centrism to the diverse practices of other than plantation-centric food production and its possibilities. Tree plantations are so deeply embedded in the practices and discourses of mushroom and especially false moral picking that not focusing on their role in formulating the multi-species livelihoods of mushroom picking would feel inadequate and biased. Refraining from plantation-centered analysis could mean that those diverse and multi-species livelihoods which are enacted with or within plantations or enabled by plantation production would be left unrecognized. On the other hand, inspired by Tuomo Alhojärvi's work on capitalocentrism, I ask, wouldn't it also be plantation-centric not to think about plantations in these kinds of landscapes and practices? Wouldn't that mean the normalization of plantations, as if they were the unquestionable truth, so obvious that it is not even worth noticing? The impossibility of non-plantation-centric thinking can also be approached from another angle. The plantation economies and the discourses that prioritize them have long eroded both the diversity of multi-species livelihoods and the possibilities to imagine other ways of producing food. We are living in the ruins of plantation economies and plantation-centrism. And in my interviews, I could see how plantation-centrism operated by narrowing down the possibilities to imagine rural livelihoods based on anything else than plantations. But wouldn't it mean sort of a hybris to think that I could do any better than my informants? That in my ivory tower, I'm capable of stepping outside of plantation-centrism? Isn't plantation-centrism also haunting me, my views and my perspectives, my analysis, my methodologies, and my concepts? In the end, what could be a more plantation-centric act than constructing a concept of plantation-centrism? So this is exactly how paranoia works. It allures us to think that there is no other legitimate or even possible ways of thinking or knowing. But this is not all it does. Paranoid, for example, plantation-centric readings can also produce knowledge that can be valuable and usable in different purposes. Although Sedgwick's essay is often read as in favor of reparative reading, in fact, Sedgwick herself stresses the usability of both ways of knowing, saying, for example, that paranoia knows some things well and others poorly. She actually speaks in favor of a flexible to and fro movement between paranoid and reparative critical practices, acknowledging the advantages and possibilities of both. Within diverse and community economies research, such openness has been fostered by, for example, Ethan Miller, who has suggested strategic paranoia, inspired by Gayatri Spivak's strategic essentialism. And already mentioned Tuomo Alhojärvi, who has developed a paranoid approach to be employed together with the reparative reading for difference. Reading for trouble refers also to the famous slogan by Donna Haraway, to stay with the trouble. So, echoing these initiatives, I also approach plantation-centrism in a strategically paranoid way, as a trouble to stay with rather than a problem to be solved. As a trouble, plantation-centrism keeps me aware of my own complicity in constructing and maintaining the hierarchical organization of modes and practices of food production, even when I'm aiming at deconstructing it. Staying with the trouble of plantation-centrism doesn't mean that other ways of knowing or practicing food production are not possible or plausible. but it reminds that any account of those possibilities is always partial and needs to be carefully situated, just as the critique of plantationocentrism itself. So here I will stop for real to leave some space for questions and comments. So thank you very much. Some mushrooms still and bibliography.
Thanks a lot, Pieta. It was really amazing to follow you in your journey of your PhD research and to be kind of inspired by the reading that you gave. And actually, I would just like to thank you for how you place plantationocentrism as trouble. It really helps me as a practitioner to kind of open up the interactions with the people tending to plantations in my valley, because in our conversations of like ecofeminists and so on, the plantations are very much our enemy, and those kind of, you know, keeping them going and caring for those plantations are somehow very often we picture them as our enemy. And I think it would help us very much to think of the plantation as a trouble that is creating troubles for us, but also for them, kind of keeping them up, needing to spray them, needing to kind of keep up that economic system. And I think really like the way you showed it as a trouble, it will help me very much in approaching it with the, you know, the plantation keepers with that idea of trouble in mind. What kind of troubles is it producing for them as well? And could those troubles be links where we can create relations and conversations? So really, thanks a lot for your reading there. I would very much invite questions from everyone there, and whoever feels like switching on their camera, please do so. I think Pieta would also very much appreciate seeing who has joined the room.
Yes, nice to see you all.
Is there already a question in the room?
I mean, I could get the ball rolling. I think I've got, I mean, Pieta, that was wonderful, and I need time to digest, especially the sort of second half of the talk. But, you know, I think what you're doing is absolutely wonderful. And I suppose, I mean, one thing this is, again, just to get the ball rolling, it's so interesting that, like, from somebody who lives in a settler society context where plantations are so much tied up with colonial violence, you know, it's so interesting that someone from the sort of, you know, European heartland, in a way, that you've come up with the concept of plantationocentrism. So I, you know, would sort of be interested to hear more about how you came up with the concept. And then so that's one thing. And then the other thing is, I was really struck by the notion of hands-on production. And it just reminds me of the research project that I worked on with Kath and with Stephen Healy and Joanne McNeil about manufacturing. And one of the things we did was to produce a video called Hands-on Work, in which we had all these images of the hands for manufacturing things. And so, you know, there's something about, and this goes back to one of your earlier slides about the immediacy of food and how food is so much part of our daily existence. And yet and yes, the hands-on, you know, I just have picked fresh Jersey Benny potatoes today that I'll be having in a little bit for dinner. So there's something about the immediacy of food and the hands. But, you know, hands are there in other practices like manufacturing, the shovels that we use to dig the potatoes, for example. So that's not a question, it's, I don't know, just more a comment about that connection between hands and things, and hands as the vehicle, you know, between us and stuff, whether the stuff's food or whether the stuff is things. So you can respond as you like, and I'm just putting them out there to get the ball rolling.
Yeah, thank you for the for your thoughts or questions, whichever they were. First, about the plantations, I cannot recall any like a specific how did it go with the concept. How did I end up with plantations? But I think it's curious that actually in Finland those tree plantations are not called plantations. The term that is used is talousmetsä, which actually is a combination of words talous, the economy, and metsä, forest. So it's like a economic forest. I think it's something called commercial forest or managed forest, like the real term in English. And yeah, in Finnish or in Finland, plantations are also like put in distance, like it's somewhere else than here, that this kind of production is taking place. So it's kind of also in here that it's put in the like even more colonial settings. We are not in any way free of colonialism or post-colonial contexts here in Finland, but maybe that's how the thinking often goes. And I think it was the article by Donna Haraway and Anna Tsing that actually like opened my eyes to the how to understand and how to kind of explain plantations in a more than human way, like not to focus solely on the violence, for example, that is inflicted towards human beings, but also that the non-human beings are also subjected to certain ways of like, for example, forced labor, as I tried to explain. So yes, but that's a good question, and I'm definitely not done with plantations yet. I think it would be fascinating to continue working on them in this context, but also I hope that others will continue in other contexts. It's a really an important topic. Then you mentioned the hands-on work in manufacturing. It sounds fascinating. I have to, if there is something that I can read or see about it, it would be really nice. And actually, that reminded me of I at some point was thinking about like the technologies that are actually, that is it like a hands in opposite to the technologies, but also in like in handmade modes of food production. Of course, different technologies are still used, like shovel or like baskets, or well, also like a more kind of complex things like some map applications on your phone or something like that. So it's not like that technologies would be somehow as opposed to hands-on practices, but I think that the technologies are kind of a way to use the hands in a different way somehow. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Pieta. Kath, you want to come in with your question?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks very much, Pieta. That was just wonderful to, again, hear about your research and think along with you. Yeah, I mean, I just had one very technical question, but before I get to that, I think the thing, I was also thinking about the Hands at Work video that we made, Jenny, when Pieta was talking about it. In some way, and to some reason, it was kind of one way we could collect photographs of all the places we went to and the processes we were looking at without having to get, permission from people to show their faces. So there was a sort of a pragmatic aspect to doing this this collection, and we put it together with some great music. But there was also a sense in which, by looking at manufacturing, we were trying to revalue that whole notion of production and hands-on kind of production that gets so devalued in our modern world, and particularly for young people, don't necessarily think about going into manufacturing as a livelihood, for instance, these days. So we were kind of trying to bring that back in, but I don't think we didn't really push it that far. So I think it could be something to develop a bit further, and other people have through craft work and so on. I think talking about the interest now in hands-on work, which really, picks up on what you were doing too. But my question was actually about the false morals and the degraded landscapes, so-called degraded landscapes that they grow in, because that was also what Anna Singh was looking at too, wasn't she, in terms of the mushroom at the end of the world. And I'm just wondering how did morals work before there was plantations? Like, is it the fact that it's the light that comes in because of the disruption of the cutting down the trees that allows then the conditions for the morals to grow? And in which case, did they only ever grow in places where trees had fallen down for true natural purposes? Or, have they evolved with plantations or not? I'm kind of just interested in the kind of technology of the morals, because if you were to think about post-plantation agriculture, if there ever could be such a thing, where would morals fit in? I mean, where would those particular fungi get a place to live? And would it just only be when there's big storms and big crashing, areas that have made light in the forest or not? Anyway, I'm just wondering whether you know what the kind of history of this particular fungi has been before the introduction of more industrial forestry, for instance.
Yeah, thank you. Mushrooms are pretty fascinating, and false moral is one of the most fascinating, at least if you ask me. They have been growing before plantation forestry, just that they haven't been fruiting as much as they do now. So there has been like some just like one or two in, like, well, as you mentioned, where a tree has been fallen, or for example, where a path has been made up by animals or human animals. So they have been growing also before, but just picking them haven't been so like extensive, because there haven't been so much of them. And actually, because mushrooms are so mushrooms, if you think of a life of a false moral, it actually also lives in the mycelium in the ground. Like the mushrooms are only the fruiting bodies of the mycelium. So it doesn't mean that if we don't see the mushrooms that it doesn't exist. So there might be also lots of false moral underground, but it just doesn't start fruiting. I'm not sure, does it go like this? I'm not a mycologist, but at least there is still something going on underground, even if we don't see the actual mushrooms.
Thanks. I'm sure Zara would have some, Zara Barron would also have some insights into all that too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks.
Pieta, I got a question really related to how you work with language as well, because I'm very fascinated by the work that you and, for instance, Tuomo are doing, and on taking community economies and diverse economies theory and seeing how does this work in your own language and so on. And I really like the word of livelihoods in English, and I struggle to find something in Italian that would kind of give that sense of, openness, that it can be multiple practices. It doesn't need to be connected to money or, to kind of standard employment contracts and so on. And so I was wondering, when you come up with the term Keskinainen and Toimentulo, is that something that you would hear people use, like in community groups, or is this really something that you are inventing and putting forward as a proposition to be taken up?
No, it's not a wording or formulation that is actually used. Of course, toimeentulo is a common word in both of its meanings. As I said, in the verb form, it's really this double meaning that comes forward, because it's really understandable. But also the noun toimeentulo can be understood in two ways. So I'm kind of playing with the word, like showing, like underlining the possibility of this double meaning, that and how it can actually kind of to be entangled, not as a two separate meanings, but kind of one. So that's the meaning of the adjective that I have attached to it. And it's of course it's a proposition to be used, but it's more maybe a proposition or like a kind of a initiative or whatsoever to start thinking about in these terms, whether using these words or this formulation or not. And therefore it can maybe also inspire to do some work in other languages as well when explained like this. So yes.
Yeah, thanks.
Also, if Tuomo wants to add something about the language work, was there a question about also that? I can see you're present.
It's really about, like, I mean, I would find it quite fascinating to be able to introduce new terms in Italian that would become common practice. For us, it's common practice to talk about diverse economies or community economies, that they just enter kind of, everyday life and the way people talk and look at the world around them. And just wondering if you feel like in Finland you're making any efforts in that sense as well, or does it stay more in a kind of academic realm, this kind of play with words or propositions?
I think it stays in the academic, but I think it has potential to disseminate as well to larger circles. Of course, when the community and diverse economies researchers are quite few and far between in Finland, there is not so much like we don't have so much like a media space or anything like that to actually do that work like publicly. But every now and then, maybe there is such an opportunity, such an option. Yeah. But also, like, of course, like the possibilities of like local languages is one reason, like to use them and try to be creative with them is one, like a reason or like the reason behind making up these words. But another reason I think is clearly that using or leaning on solely in the English terms does feel quite complicated in a Finnish or other than English environment. It would feel like importing the concepts and also then importing the ideas instead of kind of rooting them in something that is more present here somehow.
Are there any other suggestions or thoughts in the room?
I can jump in again unless there's somebody else that would like to.
Also, just put up her hand.
Oh, good, great. Please, hi there. Long time no see.
Yes, thank you very much, Pieta. I was actually just taking care of my mushrooms that I have been drying in the kitchen. And I've picked them in a plantation. I was thinking about like how like the complexities and the troubles, I guess, that you're talking about, and how, in a sense, I'm thinking we might have to just make do with what we have. So we know that making strong connections to something can make you want to sort of be a guardian or take care of something. And I've grown up in a village with plantations around me, but they're still super important. And that's where my mother, she shows me where to go to pick mushrooms and so on. So it's an intergenerational handover and lots of practice involved. And yeah, like the trouble of actually liking something that is not diverse. Like I walk into a monoculture and I see mainly one kind of mushroom, at least that's fruiting, and I guess there's not really a question in there. It's more like a reflection of what you talked made me think about, of the trouble of liking something that you're not really sort of intellectually fond of.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
For starting those thoughts.
Yeah. Thank you for the comment. It really resonated also with my own experience of being in the forest, which is almost always more or less plantation-like in Finland, but also to my experiences at the interviews with the mushroom pickers. It was actually quite extraordinary how they even met like these big timber clearings with enthusiasm. Like, okay, there is such a big, huge, good-looking timber clearing that now I have to stop the car and we have to go and look. And it's the landscape is like a kind of this moon-like landscape, like it feels that there is nothing alive. And then they were like just enjoying themselves on timber clearings. And also they had good memories of visiting certain timber clearings, maybe with their family or dogs or friends. And so the clearings also became like significant places for them. And for me as well, when I followed them on the clearings and shared the memories and experiences. So yeah, that's kind of this kind of effective side of being on the clearings or being with plantations in other ways is quite interesting. But I have also noticed another, like if think about like thinking about these affective responses, like because in Finland this rotation forestry has such a long history, like from the I would say like from the 1950s onwards, it has been mainly this kind of forestry. So the natural forests are just maybe, was it 4% of forest in Finland? So this plantation forestry is really extensive. So people don't actually recognize the forests as plantations. That picture that I showed you was quite obvious, but it is not always that obvious that forest looks like plantations. So I have also noticed, now that I have become more aware of plantation-like practices in forestry, I have also started noticing like those more subtle signs of plantation-like practices in forestry, and it has evoked this kind of I don't know if you know this uncanny valley feeling, like something reminds of a human being, but it's not quite human. So these forests, they kind of remind of forests, but it's not quite forest. There is something off. There is something weird, something unfamiliar. So it's actually a curious thing how your perception might also change when you start looking at, maybe it is a paranoid way of looking at forest, then just finding the cues of, okay, this might be also a plantation, but that's also how it is.
Yeah, I would very much like to connect to this, that the forest that where I've grown up in the Alps, I only realized maybe 10 years ago that actually these are plantations, that it's not natural that we have all the trees are the same, and that actually the forest that I played in as a kid, I mean, it was planted for human use. It was not, I mean, it's not how an alpine forest should be like. And there is a fantastic biologist, kind of already, retired in his 80s, who in the Alps says everyone becoming a forester should actually go on training to forests in Ukraine and in Romania to get an idea of what a primordial forest in Europe would look like and feel like. Because he was saying, as long as you stay within the forest in the Alps, you cannot remotely imagine how many species there could be and how many relations. And so I think also for us living locally, we take it as, that's the forest and we think it's amazing, and we somehow buy into the story that the forest is amazing, but don't have the skills to read it. And still, like what Oza said, this strong attachment to those forests. We had a kind of really strong winds in 2018 that have put down millions of trees across the eastern side of the Alps. And the year after, we had heavy snows, and so the forest was damaged again. And now we have bark beetles moving in, and they are killing the forest very fast. Like, I go to my mom's place every 2 or 3 months, and the forest is just changing, it's just dying in large patches. And although I know it's a plantation and so on, it still hurts, and there is still a strong attachment. So I think it's really interesting how complex it all is, and how layered, and how much it is about us being sensorially also very much keyed into this whole thing, even if I'm not a forestry person, or and still it's really affecting also everyday dialogue in the village. Now everyone talks about the forest and what's going on, and so I find it very fascinating, and how we can get back some of those skills of reading for those relations, and also then tending to those relations in our everyday practices. Yeah, thanks for that reflection.
I had a mini follow-up, which was what you raised with the biologist who said, go to Ukraine, go to Romania. I mean, we can move physically and geographically, but for our imaginations to find alternatives to what we have in front of us, where do we go? Sort of, that's my constant question of where do we go for expanding our imaginations, for looking for the alternatives, and is it by geographical travels, conceptualizations, sci-fi, the word for world is forests, Ursula K. Le Guin wrote. Can
I add a couple of thoughts?
Yes,
half-baked, because I'm absolutely exhausted, so I should preface my comments with that. But I think thank you very much for a wonderful talk and a really interesting discussion. I guess one of the things I was thinking about today, I was spending time with retirees and very young children in a garden, and I was observing the relationships. And I think about the ecological learning that's going on, even if it's a plantation forest, but there is this sort of that opportunity for learning in that space, even if it's not necessarily these sort of old growth forests and you're kind of observing the plantation, you're still developing a ecological kind of sensibility that I think is quite powerful for us as a species moving forward. So I think there's a real opening for a different kind of learning about, you know, how to be differently with our non-human others on Earth, even in the spaces, as you say, where you're identifying some of the kind of challenging dynamics of it, or the destruction of kind of ecological systems in those spaces. So that's just one thought. But the other thing I just wanted to say was, I think the language translation and the terms that are very specific seems a really powerful way forward for diverse economies thinking, you know, to be able to say, well, there isn't a term for livelihood, but what does the term livelihood translate to in lots of contexts? And how could we expand our vocabulary? Because, you know, my understanding is we've done work within community economies in terms of key works by Catherine and others have been translated into different languages, but I've not been aware of the nuances of the process that someone's had to go through to actually work out what the correct translation is. So I know even from my Dutch family, where there's a word like gezellig, there's no easy translation in English. So, you know, to think about those words like community economy and ethical negotiation and livelihood, and to go, well, where are the ways in which that is hard to do, like to translate? And maybe that would be a really interesting thing for members of the CERN network to kind of investigate, because it seems like that would be a really powerful exercise, you know, to sort of move away from the dominance of the English and critique the, you know, all the words that don't easily translate within the diverse and community economies work. So sorry for my ramble, but just a few reflections.
Thanks. Thanks, maybe, yeah.
Right. You want to answer or reflect?
No, you can follow if you.
Well, I was just thinking, you know, this having, I mean, I think one of the challenges is to generate more terms and not have them reduced to simple, you know, like a simplistic kind of thing. So, I mean, trying to map out different terms in different languages has been something we've tried to do in Asia quite a bit, for instance. But I'm just thinking about the getting along term that you talked about. And I just wondered how much that relates to what other, you know, you might technically call self-provisioning, you know, or not. And because it seemed like the handmade economies is talking about the actual production, but what then goes on with what is produced? Is it taken in and used as self-provisioning, or is it then shared with somebody else, or to get along, might it have to be traded in order to get some money to do something else? And how does the handmade economies, which I love as a term, feed into other kinds of the transactions? So how does getting along cover a whole lot of different things that we might call other sorts of transactions in diverse economies, or not? Because it seems like it's a lovely vernacular kind of term that could be used a lot more to try and take back the economy from, you know, the individualizing market-oriented stuff. And the getting along is already this interdependence kind of idea. And if we were talking about getting along economies, it would be really interesting to think of all the different things that would be part of it, you know. Anyway, I'm just wondering how you think about those other transactions within the concept of handmade economies or the getting along term.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I could have elaborated it more if I had the time, but yeah, I don't think handmade, like the formulation of handmade economies of food production, it just refers to the modes of how to produce. It doesn't like kind of it doesn't have any reference to the what happens then. Like it can't be like in some kind of exchange networks that is consumed, or it might be self-provisioning. And it was like in my in the empirical work that I did, like for example in the community-based farming, they both consumed the vegetables themselves, but then they also sold them. They also exchanged them as barter. And also, if you think about the urban beekeeping or the beekeepers that I interviewed, like the average yield of one beehive is 40 kilograms of honey. So, and when usually the beekeepers had like something like from 5 to 10 hives, they didn't eat 400 kilograms of honey themselves, but they also sold it. So, and when it comes to, for example, honey, it might be even quite a significant, like the monetary exchange can be quite significant, and then it can be like livelihood in that way as well. So yeah, and I kind of it was deliberate that I didn't want to define handmade economies of food production too precisely. I wanted to leave it open, a little bit in a way like diverse economies in general, like not to restrict what it might be, but to use it to direct attention to these kind of modes of food production and to show them as significant and as viable forms of production. So that was the reasoning behind the formulation. But thanks for the question.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, hi.
Hello. Hi, Pieta. Nice to see
Hi.
you. It's been a long time. Yeah, it was wonderful. Thank you again. I had a question. I guess it's about plantationocentrism and race, or racialization, and racialized groups of people. So, what I see kind of happening in your presentation and your take is kind of move, or the kind of formulation of plantationocentrism is a kind of move from the history of slavery and plantations in a context of slavery into a more general term, which describes environmental and social change. And it's kind of, as I understand it, it's kind of parallel to how decolonization has been used, kind of has been metaphorized in a way to a more general use beyond the kind of simple cases of indigenous and racialized populations and land rights and so on. And of course, there's been a lot of critique concerning the use of decolonization in a metaphoric sense, or in a non-land-based sense, in a non-indigenous peoples, in a non-racialized populations-based sense. And I wonder if a similar critique could be or should be attached to the use of plantationocentrism, or the kind of metaphoric use of plantation in a sense, because kind of I'm thinking of several debates. Firstly, I know that Donna Haraway and Anna Tsing and other kind of minority worldwide scholars have received criticism for their use of Plantationocene as a kind of general framework, and how it's not very much attached to what's happening in Black studies or decolonial studies, or debates around racial capitalism, for instance. And at the same time, there's kind of critique or a critical discussion concerning how race or racialized populations have been missing from diverse economies. And there's kind of in recent years, there's literature coming from Black studies and from decolonial perspectives, kind of addressing the problems within the kind of diverse economies framework. So with these kind of background ideas, I'm thinking about how how your notion of plantationocentrism relates or could relate to what's happening in Finland in terms of racialized groups of people. For instance, in recent years, there's the hugely problematic cases of berry pickers being flown from Thailand and other places in Southeast Asia to pick berries in Finland with very problematic contracts and indentured kind of servitude type of situations. And there's I just checked, there's a short mention in your PhD about how racialized groups of people are kind of often missing from food activism. I don't know, this doesn't concern Finland specifically, but I guess the food activism scene also in Finland tends to be quite white, to put it bluntly. So I'm just juggling with these thoughts and trying to think about how race or racialization relates to your use of the concept and how it should or could relate to it.
Yes, thanks. Thank you for raising this question and this important topic. As I ended my talk with the need to be situated and situate the work with plantations or plantationocentrism carefully, and that should be done in order not to just use plantations or plantationocentrism as metaphors, but also to attach it to the particular places or particular violences, particular questions and topics in a situated livelihoods and lives of people and others. And in my work, I have actually raised the question of the berry pickers in Finland, who are, many of them, come from Thailand at the moment. Thousands of people from Thailand are flown every summer to Finland to pick berries for the Finnish companies, and there has been quite a lot of discussion of their position and what kind of abuse is happening in the work, or is it not? And there has been also some court cases and prison sentences. So it is quite obvious that there is that it can be said that is some sort of forced labor in many ways. Not all, of course, because things are not that straightforward. So yes, I think it's and in my work I actually went then back to when thinking about berry picking as the activity of my interviewees. They were also picking berries besides mushrooms, but it was such a different thing for them because they were guarded by their membership of the welfare state. So they didn't. So it's almost incomparable how they were picking berries and how the people that are brought here to work on for the Finnish companies are picking berries. And it actually the way that the people in these more precarious conditions are doing the work, it kind of reminds of work done on plantations. It's collective, it's hierarchically organized, it's not involuntary, but there is more limited options. So it's somewhere in the spectrum of forced labor in somehow, obviously more than in the case of the Finnish mushroom and berry pickers. And furthermore, another question in this kind of situated case of mushroom picking in Finland, another like a colonial or racial question could be, and that I actually also did raise in the article, was the question of Sami people, the indigenous people of Finland, and their land rights, which are obviously also being compromised by the forestry in Finland, and have been for long. And from that perspective, it becomes more and more obvious that it is actually plantation production, even if it's not considered like that from the majority Finnish perspective, but from the Sami perspective, the signs of plantations are more clear, because there is different kind of violence, different kind of land grabbing and so on going on, and has been going on. So yeah, such an important things, and really good to raise them up, at least here in the discussion.
I mean, it's interesting that it's really only from the 1950s that this kind of plantation forestry, if what you're saying, has really taken hold. So presumably before that, was the land under Sami ownership, or was it small farmers that owned the land? And the same thing in the Alps. I wondered, what was the land tenure, and what ethnic groups or indigenous groups had rights to that land before these big plantation kind of forestry took root. And I guess probably a lot of it was done by the state originally too, I wonder. Not agribusiness, I don't know. But anyway, it just seems like there's a wonderful, or not a wonderful, or probably horrific and violent history here that, again, you've kind of, all of us are brought up with, thinking it's normal. It's normalized that there's these state forests or whatever. And it's only now that we're doing the kind of truth telling about where these relationships have come from, that have then established certain ecologies that we think are normal, which they aren't. But anyway, I'm sure that's way beyond the scope of what you're doing. But to do that kind of racialization reading, and the way in which hierarchical race relations have been embedded in economies and in plantationism, we need to start doing that kind of genealogy, I think, and bringing it to the present, because it's not like it's all in the past. It's still pretty present here, and that's certainly in Australia. That's happening all the time now, I think, with all our forests and with all the kind of conflicts around them, but also the way in which we're learning so much more about the ecologies of the environment pre-settler, and luckily I'm very fortunate we're able to still, Aboriginal people are still present to be able to teach us some of that. But it's very hard to, we have to learn a whole other way of reading the landscape and reading nature in a way that is going to take a long time to kind of do that in a way that's not extractive and exploitative, but is actually that kind of reciprocity of learning. Anyway, just a bit of a rave there, but it seems like there's a really productive area here to be working on, it seems, Pieta. So thank you so much for opening it up for us.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe just a word about the land ownership. It's not that straightforward. Well, like the history of land ownership, or how the Sami have lost their lands or are losing their lands. Like the history of land grabbing in Finland, it extends for centuries, and it's not that kind of simple that it has been just like concentrating to to state or big companies. It has like also some big forestry companies own now quite large patches of land, but land ownership in Finland is actually quite diverse, and many like ordinary people in Finland own a little patch of forest every there and there, and so it hasn't been actually in the ownership, or the ownership hasn't been the way how the plantation forestry has been like implemented, but it has come through like a forest policies which have actually forced the forest owners to manage their forest in a certain way. So there hasn't been any option for this rotation forestry, so clear cuttings basically, until the 1990s, I think. Then it became more flexible, a little bit more flexible. But of course, now the culture has been kind of established, it's still the main way to manage your forests. So it's a complicated history, but yeah.
Maybe I got a last question, I think, on like, because now we touched a lot on ownership of land as well, and I'm wondering, how do you see that your current research on post-ownership, do you see bridges between what you did in your PhD, what you uncovered there, and the work that you are doing now?
Thanks. Nice question. I do see the bridges. Like one of pretty obvious bridge is that I'm still working within or with the tools of community and diverse economies research. Like my understanding of ownership comes like for a big part from there, like, and how to think about ownership differently, or property in a more diverse way. So in that, yes, but also maybe in a way that takes us back to hands, or the materialities of things. I haven't like it maybe has followed me then from the PhD, that to focus on the materiality and how things actually are not only like ownership is not an abstract relation, but there is actually something to be owned that can be also grasped often, or if not, then it's a different kind of ownership. That also like the material culture of like different kind of items or car or whatever urban space is still present in my thinking, maybe coming from the work that I did with food.
Thanks, Pieta. Are there any other questions in the room? Or I think we had a wonderful conversation. It was, yeah, I really appreciate that finally I got you, to hear you speak about your work and to get all those nuances that in the written text, might not be there, and it's very different. I appreciated it a lot.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks you for all the comments and questions. It was such a pleasure also to discuss this with you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Pieta.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Really great.